Summer 1778. Washington's every plan reached British headquarters before his own officers heard it. The Continental Army was bleeding secrets. Nathan Hale had shown them the price of amateur spycraft. The British found papers in his coat and hanged him at dawn. His last words about having but one life to give: noble, poetic, useless. Dead men gather no intelligence. Washington understood the arithmetic. You can't fight an enemy you can't see unless you become one. He didn't need heroes. Heroes get statues and unmarked graves. He needed ghosts. People willing to dissolve into occupied New York, to pour coffee for British officers while memorizing their conversations, to hang laundry while encoding troop movements in the arrangement of petticoats. People who understood that their greatest service might be letting their neighbours think them traitors. This is the story of America's first spy ring, of ordinary people who learned that revolution's most vital intelligence could be written in invisible ink, hidden between the lines of a merchant's letter about cabbage prices. They called themselves Culper. For 6 years, they gathered the intelligence that would help birth a nation. Their reward? To return to their shops and farms, carrying secrets to unmarked graves, unknown, unremembered, exactly as planned. If you're drawn to history's darker corners, where patriotism whispers instead of shouts, consider subscribing. So take a slow, deep breath, settle in, and let me tell you how a handful of ghosts saved a revolution, and then disappeared back into the ordinary lives they never really left. The tavern in Setauket smelled of pipe tobacco and fear that autumn evening in 1778. Abraham Woodhull sat in the corner where the shadows gathered thickest, nursing a cider that had gone warm in his hands. The other patrons gave him a wide berth. He'd been making trips to Manhattan, selling produce to the British, coming back with hard currency while Patriot families scraped by on worthless continental paper. The kind of man who bent with the wind, the kind of man who survived, which made him exactly the kind of man Benjamin Tallmadge was looking for. The cavalry officer moved through the tavern like smoke through trees, Yale-educated, battle-tested, with the kind of desperate energy that comes from watching your friend Nathan Hale march off to his amateur's death. He and Woodhull had grown up within shouting distance of each other. Tallmadge knew exactly what kind of pressure to apply. He spoke quietly, his words barely carrying across the scarred wooden table. Washington needed men in New York, not soldiers. Long Island crawled with soldiers, all of them wearing red coats. What he needed were ghosts, men who could move through British lines like smoke through a forest, men who could listen without seeming to hear, who could remember without seeming to notice. The proposition was simple as a knife between the ribs. Continue the trips, continue playing the self-interested merchant, but while selling cabbages and buying cloth, notice things. Troop movements, supply shipments, officers' names and their habits. Write it all down in letters that would seem to discuss nothing but the price of wheat and the quality of wool. Never sign his real name. Never tell his family. Never expect anyone to know what he'd done when the war ended. If it ended. If they won. If he lived that long. The tavern door creaked open. British boots. Heavy treads. Muskets casual over their shoulders. Conversation stuttered and died like a flame in rain. Woodhull and Tallmadge sat frozen. Two men discussing nothing more treasonous than the weather and the price of grain. Their hearts hammering betrayal against their ribs. The soldiers found seats near the fire. Slowly, carefully, talk resumed. The moment passed like a cloud across the moon, but it left its lesson behind. This was what the rest of his life would be like. Every door opening could be death walking in. Tallmadge waited. He'd made his offer. Now came the hardest part of recruitment, letting the fish hook himself. Woodhull thought of his cousin, Brigadier General Nathaniel Woodhull, captured after the Battle of Long Island. The British had denied him medical care. Let him rot in a barn like livestock. He died calling for water that never came. The family had never spoken of it. Some things were too large for words, but Talmadge knew. Of course he knew. That's why he was here. Woodhull didn't say yes. He didn't have to. He simply asked when he should start. His voice hollow as a musket barrel. Immediately, Talmadge said. The next trip to Manhattan. And he'd need a name. Something to sign his letters with. Something that meant nothing to anyone. Woodhull thought of Samuel Culper, a name he'd seen in an old ledger once. A nobody, a fiction. Perfect. Samuel Culper then, he said, and felt Abraham Woodhull begin to disappear. The candle flame steadied. Outside, October wind rattled windows like bones in a cup, and in the corner of a Setauket tavern, a ghost was born. A ghost who would spend the next 6 years haunting the British Army's every move, one invisible letter at a time, because some men, when history taps them on the shoulder, can't help but turn around, even when they know it's going to cost them everything. And it would. If Woodhull was the Ring's beating heart on Long Island, then Robert Townsend was its ears in Manhattan. The coffee house on Water Street hummed with the particular energy of occupied prosperity. British officers in scarlet coats clustered around tables, their gorgets catching lamplight like small suns. The air hung thick with pipe smoke and roasted beans. That bitter burnt smell that one contemporary described as syrup of soot mixed with the essence of old shoes. Behind the counter stood a merchant in his late 20s, unremarkable in every way that mattered. Robert Townsend had one of those faces that slip from memory the moment you looked away. Neither handsome nor ugly, neither memorable nor strange, just there, like furniture, like air, the perfect face for a spy, though he'd have to be convinced of that. He moved between tables with practiced invisibility, pouring coffee, making change, letting conversation flow around him like water around a stone. The British officers spoke freely in his presence. Why wouldn't they? He was nobody. The man pouring your coffee doesn't exist in your world, any more than the chair you're sitting on or the cup you're drinking from. And Townsend? He listened. Not obviously. Never obviously. He'd learned to pour coffee while memorizing troop deployments, to count coins while calculating ammunition stores. A major mentions his regiment is moving north next week. A captain complains about supply shortages. A colonel jokes about the new defensive positions being built on the heights. Each fragment filed away in a memory trained by years of keeping account books. The genius of his position was its perfect mundanity. He ran a dry goods business on the side, which gave him every reason to ask about ships arriving. Goods available, prices fluctuating. What goods are coming in from London, sir? Any military supplies I should know about? The officers, flush with their importance, were happy to show off their knowledge to a mere merchant. Some of them even liked him. He wrote for Rivington's Royal Gazette, after all, the most violently loyalist paper in the colonies. What better credentials could a merchant have? But Woodhull had seen through it somehow. Maybe it takes one reluctant spy to recognise another. Townsend's Quaker upbringing should have made him a pacifist. But the British had commandeered his family's home in Oyster Bay, turned it into a barracks. Some things could push even a peaceful man to war. Still, Townsend had resisted at first. The risk was enormous. In Manhattan, surrounded by thousands of British troops, one slip meant the noose. But Woodhull had been persistent, and eventually Townsend had agreed. Not from patriotic fervour. He left that to other men. He agreed because someone had to do it, and he was uniquely positioned, and because the British officers who drank his coffee had made it personal. He never signed his real name to anything after that. Every letter, every report, every piece of intelligence went out under the name Samuel Culper Jr. He was disappearing more completely with every passing day, by choice, by necessity, by inches. The coffeehouse door chimed. More officers, shaking October rain from their cloaks. Townsend moved to greet them, pot in hand, his merchant smile perfectly calibrated. They would talk, as they always did, about movements and munitions, about strategy and supply, and tomorrow, a letter would make its way to Setauket, hidden among legitimate business correspondence. One of the officers was complaining about patrol schedules on Long Island. Another mentioned new artillery pieces arriving next month. Townsend poured their coffee, black as the conscience he was slowly selling, and memorised every word. History has its jokes. Townsend pouring coffee while officers discussed troop movements was one of the cruelest. The black petticoat snapped in the salt wind like a flag of war that only 3 people could read. Anna Strong stood at her clothesline on Strong's neck, fingers red from the October cold and the coarse linen. Below her, Long Island Sound stretched grey as old pewter, its surface broken by white caps that looked like teeth. Across that expanse of water lay Connecticut and safety. But first, messages had to cross that divide. The system was beautiful in its simplicity. When Caleb Brewster's whaleboat slipped across the Sound under cover of darkness, when he'd hidden his boat in one of 6 predetermined coves, Anna would know. A black petticoat on the line meant a message was waiting. The number of white handkerchiefs hanging beside it. 1, 2, 3, up to 6, indicated which cove held Brewster's boat. That was all. No codes to memorise, no ciphers to break. Just a housewife doing her washing on a Tuesday morning, while the fate of armies hung in the folds of her linens. The British never suspected. Why would they? Laundry was women's work. Beneath notice. Certainly beneath suspicion. The soldiers quartered in the main house might glance out and see her at her daily chores, but they'd never think to count handkerchiefs. Laundry doesn't lie. Laundry doesn't have opinions. Laundry is just there. But Anna Strong knew better. Her husband's cellar sat in Connecticut exile, banished there after the British had thrown him onto the prison ship Jersey for treasonable correspondence. She'd used family connections, Loyalist family connections, to buy his release, to get him paroled across the Sound. The British had let her stay to manage the property. After all, someone had to maintain the estate. A woman alone. What harm could she do? The harm she could do was hanging on her line right now. 6 handkerchiefs today. The 6th cove. The hardest to reach but the safest from patrols. Woodhull would see it from his farm across the bay, and tonight he'd make his way to that hidden inlet where Caleb Brewster waited. Brewster. Now there was a man who did espionage like other men, did tavern brawls, loudly, recklessly, with a grin that suggested he was enjoying himself far too much. While the rest of the ring practiced invisibility, Brewster commanded a whaleboat crew that terrorized Loyalist shipping. The Sound was his highway, its currents and coves as familiar as his own heartbeat. Once, when British ships had him boxed in, he'd actually taunted them, calling insults across the water while his men rowed for their lives into waters too shallow for their deeper drafts. Some men do courage quietly, wrapped in shadows and secrecy. Caleb Brewster did it at full volume, as if the whole enterprise was a cosmic joke and he was the only one who understood the punchline. Anna adjusted the handkerchiefs, making sure they were visible from across the bay. Her fingers were numb now, but she stayed at the line, adding a few more pieces, a shift, some aprons, her daughter's small dress. Normal washing for a normal Tuesday, except for the 6 white squares that meant a continental courier was coming tonight. The wind picked up, setting all the clothes to dancing. The black petticoat twisted and writhed like a living thing. From the house, she heard British voices, officers calling for their breakfast. She'd go serve them in a moment, the dutiful housewife maintaining her property. They'd eat at her table, sleep in her beds, never knowing that their hostess was writing intelligence reports in the very air above their heads. For 6 years, This would be her contribution to the revolution, a black petticoat and varying numbers of handkerchiefs, hung with precision on a clothesline overlooking the Sound. No glory in it, no recognition, just the knowledge that she'd helped messages flow from the coffee houses of Manhattan to the councils of war. One load of laundry at a time, the British were looking for complex codes, for sophisticated networks, for the machinery of espionage. They never thought to watch the laundry. That was their first mistake. It wouldn't be their last. The candle flame wavered in the draught from under the door, making shadows dance across Abraham Woodhull's hands as he prepared to write treason. His shop was closed, Sir Talcott asleep around him. Outside, October wind rattled shutters like skeleton fingers tapping for entry. But here, in this small circle of yellow light, Woodhull sat with the instruments of his double life, 2 bottles of ink and a soul divided against itself. The first bottle held ordinary ink, black as any merchant would use. The second held Dr. James J's sympathetic stain, clear as water, invisible as conscience. Not the simple lemon juice or milk that any kitchen maid might use, revealed by the heat of a candle. This was sophisticated chemistry, a solution that would remain invisible until brushed with a specific reagent. The British knew such things existed. They checked suspicious letters with heat, with chemicals, with everything their own scientists could devise. But they couldn't read what Dr. J had created. Washington called it medicine in his letters, as if it could cure the disease of British occupation. He dipped his quill in the black ink first. The legitimate letter came easily. My dear friend, the cabbages I promised have been delivered as specified, though the price was higher than expected. The recent rains have affected the harvest throughout the county. Mundane, boring. Exactly the kind of letter a Long Island merchant would send to his connections in Connecticut. But now came the real work. He cleaned his quill carefully, then dipped it in the clear solution. Between the lines of his merchant's letter, in the wide margins he'd left for just this purpose, he began to write the truth. 3 regiments of regulars arrived Tuesday last. The 17th Light Dragoons are quartered at Jamaica. Artillery pieces, 12-pounders by my count, were unloaded at Whitestone. His hand shook. It always shook when he used the invisible ink, as if his body knew what his mind tried to forget, that each word was a step toward the gallows. The numbers came next. Tallmadge had developed a substitution cipher, a dictionary of codes that turned names and places into arithmetic. 711, General Washington. 722, Abraham Woodhull. 723, Robert Townsend. 727, New York City. 745, England. The list ran to 763 entries. Without the code book, the numbers were meaningless. With it, they revealed the revolution's most precious secrets. The system wasn't perfect. Sometimes they ran out of the sympathetic stain. But every letter was an act of faith. Faith that the courier wouldn't be caught. Faith that the invisible ink would remain invisible. Faith that the cipher would hold. The paranoia was constant now. Every creak of the building made him freeze, listening for the sound of British boots on stairs. 3 times he'd burned letters because something felt wrong. A shadow at the window, a dog barking too insistently, his own nerves screaming danger where none existed. Fear didn't make you careful. It made you exhausting, but it kept you alive. He sealed the letter with ordinary wax, pressing his merchant's seal into the red puddle. Tomorrow it would travel with Austin Rowe, hidden among legitimate business correspondence. It would pass through British checkpoints where bored soldiers might rifle through the papers, might even read this particular letter about cabbage prices. They'd never know they held the position of 3 regiments in their hands. 5 times now he'd written to Tallmadge begging to be released. His nerves were shattered. But Tallmadge always asked him to stay, just a little longer, and Woodhull always stayed. Because what else could he do? He'd already given everything. What was a little more? He extinguished the candle with wet fingers, plunging the room into darkness. Tomorrow he'd be Abraham Woodhull, merchant. Tonight, in this last moment before sleep, he let himself be what he truly was. Samuel Culper Sr., spy. Writing revolution's history in ink that no one could see. The British were looking for sophisticated codes, encrypted masterpieces, complex ciphers that would take their best minds to crack. The Culper Ring gave them arithmetic and chemistry, hidden in plain sight, which is why it worked. 2 years, 730 days of lying with every breath, and Abraham Woodhull was coming apart at the seams. He sat in his Setauket shop, October 1780, writing another letter to Benjamin Tallmadge. Not in code this time, not in invisible ink, just the raw, desperate truth. I cannot continue. My nerves are shattered. Every day I feel the noose tightening around my neck. I beg you to release me from this service before it destroys what little remains of my sanity. He'd written variations of this letter 5 times now. Each time, Tallmadge had responded with sympathy, understanding, and a request for just a little more time. Just until spring. Just until this operation was complete. Just until they could find a replacement. And each time, Woodhull had agreed, because what else could he do? He'd already sacrificed his reputation, his peace of mind, his future. What was another season in hell? The breakdown had been building for months. It started with small things. Hands that shook when he tried to write. A stammer when British officers questioned him at checkpoints. Then came the insomnia. Every creak of his house became British soldiers coming to arrest him. He'd lie awake calculating how long it would take them to break down his door, whether he could destroy his papers before they took him. Last month, a British patrol had stopped him on the road to Manhattan. The officer, a sharp-eyed captain, had questioned him for an hour. Why these frequent trips? What business did a Setauket merchant have in the city? Woodhull had stammered through his prepared story, his voice cracking like a guilty man's. The captain had let him go eventually, but not before delivering a warning. "We're watching you, Mr. Woodhull. Men who travel between the lines bear watching." He'd barely made it home before the shaking started. Full-body tremors that left him gasping on his shop floor, certain that tomorrow would bring the arrest squad and the quick trial and the slow death. But tomorrow had brought only another day of pretending, and another, and another. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. He couldn't tell his father, Richard, why his son had become so nervous, so withdrawn. The old judge, a fierce patriot who'd been beaten by British soldiers for his beliefs, now looked at Abraham with barely concealed disappointment. Here was his son, trading with the enemy, growing rich on British gold while better men suffered for the cause. His neighbours had stopped speaking to him entirely. In their eyes, he was, at best, a coward who put profit over principle. At worst, he was a collaborator. Even his dreams of marriage had withered. What woman would have him now? The door to his shop opened. Austin Rowe, the tavern keeper who served as their courier. Another run to Manhattan planned for tomorrow. Intelligence that needed gathering. Woodhull wanted to scream. There was no intelligence worth this price. No military secret that balanced against a man's sanity slowly leaking away. Instead, he heard himself agreeing. Because of course he did. Because Tallmadge was counting on him. Because Washington needed the information. Because he'd already given everything. What was a little more? He returned to his letter about shattered nerves and unbearable pressure. Then, with movements automatic as breathing, he added a postscript. "I will continue as requested through the winter, S. Culper Sr. Because once you've given everything, what's a little more? Once you're already dead to your neighbours, what's another few months?" The arithmetic of sacrifice had its own brutal logic, and Woodhull had become an expert in its calculations. This is what heroism looks like up close. It looks like falling apart piece by piece. While everyone watches and no one sees, it looks like Abraham Woodhull at his desk, agreeing to another season in hell because the alternative, stopping, had become literally unthinkable. Just a merchant, just a traitor, just a ghost, haunting his own life until the war ended, or he did, whichever came first. Of all the bitter jokes the revolution played on its participants, James Rivington's might have been the cruelest. The print shop on Wall Street reeked of ink and irony in equal measure. Here, on printing presses that clattered like artillery fire, Rivington produced the most rabidly loyalist newspaper in occupied New York. The Royal Gazette's masthead bore the British crown in all its glory, and its pages dripped with venom for the rebel cause. Washington was a traitor, the Continental Congress, a pack of criminals, the revolution itself, the doomed tantrum that would end with its leaders dangling from British rope. And the man setting this type, he was counting British regiments for George Washington. Rivington moved through his shop like a man navigating a minefield of his own making. Before the war, he'd been exactly what he appeared, a printer with loyalist sympathies and a good head for business. When the British took New York, his paper became their unofficial voice. British officers loved him. He drank with them, dined with them, printed their proclamations and their propaganda with equal enthusiasm. But somewhere in 1779, Robert Townsend had approached him. Maybe it was pragmatism, a bet on which side would ultimately win. Maybe it was the promise of protection when the Americans eventually returned. Or maybe he'd grown sick of printing lies and decided to balance the scales in his own peculiar way. Whatever the reason, he'd agreed. Code number 726. Another ghost in Culper's choir of shadows. The irony was magnificent in its completeness. Here was a man publicly reviled by every patriot in America, burning in effigy from Boston to Charleston, and he was feeding Washington intelligence from the very heart of British command. The officers who trusted him with their announcements never guessed that their printer was memorizing every detail. His methods were as clever as his position. When passing intelligence, he'd write messages on the tissue-thin paper used for the end papers of books. These books would then be sold through his shop to Culper agents, who could carry them through checkpoints without suspicion. Sometimes the intelligence was spectacular. Troop movements, supply shortages, strategic plans discussed over port wine and pipe smoke. All of it flowed through Rivington's ink-stained fingers to Washington's desk. But here's where the joke turned cruel. Rivington was so good at his cover that he convinced everyone patriots wanted him dead. His name appeared on blacklists and prescription rolls. He received death threats slipped under his door, and he had to take it. Had to print his next editorial praising British valour and condemning rebel atrocities, knowing it would generate more hatred, more threats, more promises of retribution. He was a patriot pretending to be a loyalist, being called a traitor by patriots who didn't know he was a patriot. The layers of deception wrapped around each other like a noose. Some nights, after the presses had stopped, Rivington would stand in his shop surrounded by stacks of his own newspaper. Every issue a lie, every editorial a performance, every word calculated to maintain a cover that was slowly becoming his prison. He couldn't stop. Breaking character would mean death, but continuing meant being reviled by the very people he was trying to help. The war would end eventually, the British would leave, and what then? Would Washington reveal the truth? Would the mob hunting for Loyalist blood pause to listen? Or would James Rivington, that Patriot spy, swing from a liberty tree because he'd played his part too well? He picked up his composing stick and began setting type for tomorrow's edition, an editorial condemning the French alliance. Each letter clicked into place with metallic precision, building lies to hide truths, maintaining a cover that had become indistinguishable from reality. The presses would run tomorrow, the Royal Gazette would hit the streets, patriots would curse Rivington's name, loyalists would toast his health, and somewhere in between, in that space where truth became lies became truth again. James Rivington would continue his impossible dance. History has its jokes. This was one of the cruelest, and Rivington was both the comedian and the punchline. Summer 1780 arrived like fever, hot, disorienting, and carrying the smell of something rotten. Robert Townsend noticed it first. British officers who'd been gloomy about their prospects suddenly sparkled with barely concealed excitement. Whispered conferences that stopped when civilians approached. And over it all, like smoke from a distant fire, the name that kept recurring, Major John Andre. Andre had taken over British intelligence operations in April 1779, and he was everything his predecessor hadn't been: charming, brilliant, artistic, and absolutely ruthless about hunting the Culper Ring. He knew they existed. He'd made finding them his personal mission. The irony was exquisite. The best spy hunter in the British Army was about to be undone by the spies he couldn't find. Townsend's first concrete intelligence came in early summer. A high-ranking American officer was in contact with the British, not just passing information, negotiating something bigger. He wrote it all in invisible ink, encoded it in numbers, sent it through the chain. Benjamin Tallmadge read it by candlelight and felt his blood turn to ice water. A general, an American general, was planning to betray them. Then, in August, Townsend sent the intelligence that changed everything. Benedict Arnold, the hero of Saratoga, the man Washington had just appointed to command West Point. West Point, the key to the Hudson River, the fortress that kept New England connected to the rest of the colonies. If the British took West Point, they could split the rebellion in half. Arnold would weaken the fort's defences and surrender it to the British for £20,000 sterling. Andre would personally coordinate the surrender. The Revolutionary War could be over by Christmas. Woodhull's report was desperate. Andre would travel through Westchester County on September 22nd, returning from his meeting with Arnold. Washington moved with subtle precision. He couldn't arrest Arnold without proof, but he could increase patrols in Westchester. He could set a trap without appearing to set one. September 22nd, 1780. A checkpoint near Tarrytown. 3 militiamen, John Paulding, David Williams, and Isaac Van Wart, doing the tedious work of watching a road. A rider approaching, well-dressed, nervous. Papers that didn't match his story. "Check his boots," Van Wart said. The rider's face went white. Inside the second boot, documents hidden in Benedict Arnold's handwriting. Plans for West Point's fortifications, artillery positions, troop strength, everything the British would need. The man was Major John Andre, Spymaster, caught by the spies he'd hunted. Andre faced his captors with dignity. He'd been caught in civilian clothes behind enemy lines with incriminating documents. By the laws of war, he was a spy. The penalty was death. He asked to be shot like a soldier rather than hang like a spy. Washington refused. October 2nd, 1780. Andre was hanged in Tappan, New York, maintaining his composure to the end. Arnold escaped to British lines and would live another 21 years in exile, comfortable but despised. Even the British didn't fully trust a traitor. Back in New York, Townsend heard the news in his coffee house. British officers wept openly. Andre had been loved. Now he was gone, undone by the very networks he'd tried so hard to uncover. Townsend poured their wine, offered appropriate condolences, and felt nothing at all. Andre had been hunting him for over a year. Now the hunt was over, ended by 3 militiamen and a pair of expensive boots. And the Culper Ring? They went back to work. More letters about vegetables hiding military intelligence. More laundry hanging in coded patterns. More coffee poured for officers who never guessed. Because the war wasn't over. And ghosts don't take bows. The Spymaster, caught by the spies he couldn't catch. Sometimes history doesn't make sense. Sometimes it just happens. as random and ridiculous as papers hidden in a boot, as simple and catastrophic as 3 militiamen who decided to be thorough. Victory, when it finally came, sounded like silence. October 1781, Yorktown. Cornwallis trapped between Washington's army and the French fleet. The world turned upside down, and the most powerful empire on earth admitted defeat to a rebellion it had never quite understood. In New York, still under British occupation, the Culper Ring heard the news like everyone else, through rumours that grew more solid with each passing day. The war was over, independence was real, and what now for the ghosts? Abraham Woodhull sat in his Setauket shop, reading Talmadge's latest letter by candlelight, not in code this time, no invisible ink, just plain words. The work is nearly done. Maintain your positions until the British evacuation is complete, then await further instructions. Further instructions, as if there was a manual for how to stop being invisible. The months that followed Yorktown were perhaps the strangest of all. The war was over, but the occupation continued. The Culper Ring kept watching, kept reporting, kept playing their roles in a drama whose ending had already been written. Then, in 1783, came the orders they'd been expecting and dreading. Destroy everything, burn the letters, forget the codes, never speak of this. Washington's reasoning was sound. The war was over, but America would need intelligence networks in the future, protecting methods, protecting sources. It all made perfect sense, unless you were the source being protected, the method being erased. Woodhull burned his papers in the same fireplace where he'd melted wax to seal his secret reports. Years of fear, years of service going up in smoke. When it was done, only Abraham Woodhull remained, a merchant, a neighbour, a nobody. He would live another 43 years, marry Mary Smith in 1781, father 3 children, serve as a judge. He never spoke of the Culper Ring, not to his wife, not to his children, not even on his deathbed in 1826, 50 years after independence. Robert Townsend returned to his family home in Oyster Bay. He lived as a bachelor with his sister Sally, growing more reclusive with each passing year. He died in 1838, taking Samuel Culper Jr. to the grave. His secret wouldn't be discovered for another 90 years. Anna Strong went back to being just a housewife. Her black petticoat hung on the line with no more meaning than laundry should have. When President Washington toured Long Island in 1790, he stopped to visit the Strongs. A courtesy call on old friends. The neighbours thought it an honour. They never knew they were watching a general thank his spy. Caleb Brewster went back to sea, whaling ships instead of whale boats. The spy work stayed locked away. He died in 1827, the terror of the Sound reduced to an old man's memories. James Rivington lasted longest in the public eye, and paid the highest price. When the British evacuated New York in November 1783, he stayed. Washington's protection kept him from the mob, but it couldn't save his business. The Royal Gazette folded. He died in 1802, poor and forgotten. History would remember him as the King's printer. His service to the Revolution remained hidden for another 150 years. Benjamin Talmadge went on to a successful career in Congress. His memoir barely mentioned his intelligence work. "I opened a private correspondence with some persons in New York," was all he would say. Washington kept his promise. No medals, no parades, no public acknowledgement. In 1790, when Washington toured Long Island as president, he made a peculiar series of social calls. The Strong family, the Woodhull farm, Austin Rose Tavern. To observers, it looked like a president greeting local dignitaries. Only Washington and his host knew the truth. A commander-in-chief saying thank you to the ghost who'd helped him win a war. No speeches, no ceremonies, just a hand on a shoulder, a quiet word, a look that said what couldn't be spoken aloud. The Culper Ring dissolved like morning fog when the sun finally rises. One moment they were there, essential to victory. The next, they were gone, returned to their ordinary lives, carrying extraordinary secrets that history wouldn't discover for generations. They'd won. That had to be enough. They'd chosen invisibility and received exactly what they'd bargained for. Victory without recognition, success without acclaim, patriotism without anyone ever knowing they'd been patriots at all. Because that's what ghosts do. They haunt, they help, they disappear, and history moves on. In 1929, a Long Island historian named Morton Pennypacker made a discovery that would have shocked the dust off his archives. He was researching the Townsend family, going through old papers in their ancestral home, account books, business correspondence. The detritus of lives lived 2 centuries ago. And then he noticed something. The handwriting in Robert Townsend's ledgers looked familiar. Very familiar. He'd been studying George Washington's intelligence files, those cryptic letters signed Samuel Culper Jr. The loops of the letters, the slant of the words, they matched. Perfectly. Pennypacker consulted handwriting experts. They confirmed what his eyes had seen, after 150 years of silence. Samuel Culper Jr. had a name. Robert Townsend, the quiet merchant of Oyster Bay, had been Washington's primary spy in New York. The discovery opened floodgates. If Culper Jr. was Townsend, then Culper Sr. must be Abraham Woodhull, the woman with the clothesline, Anna Strong, the whaleboat captain, Caleb Brewster. One by one, the ghosts got their names back. Too late for them to hear it. History loves its generals. Washington crossing the Delaware, Lafayette at Yorktown, Greene in the Carolinas. We build monuments to men who led armies in daylight. History loves its battles. Bunker Hill, Saratoga, the shot heard round the world. We mark the places where men died loudly for liberty. But the American Revolution wasn't won by the loudest voices or the boldest charges. It was won in the spaces between what was said and what was heard. In coffee houses where merchants counted soldiers. On clotheslines where laundry spoke in code. In the invisible ink between innocent words about cabbage prices. The Culper Ring gave everything history says it values: courage, sacrifice, service to cause greater than self. They just gave it quietly. They chose to be forgotten so their country could be free. They accepted hatred from their neighbours so Washington could read British plans. They lived with fear every day for 6 years so that future generations could live without it. Their bargain was simple and brutal: glory for victory, recognition for survival, their names for a nation. They kept their end of it. When you think of American independence, think of the signatures on the Declaration. Bold, visible, famous. John Hancock writing large enough for King George to read without his spectacles. Then think of the signatures that were never written, the names that stayed in shadow. The people who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is disappear. Abraham Woodhull died believing his neighbours thought him a coward or a traitor. Robert Townsend died with his secret intact. Anna Strong's clothesline code went with her to the grave. They chose this, chose to be erased from the story they helped write. The British looked for them for 6 years and never found them. They were too busy searching for sophisticated networks, elaborate covers, master spies. They never thought to look at the merchant selling them supplies, the housewife hanging her laundry, the newspaper publisher printing their propaganda. The Culper Ring hid in the most dangerous place of all, plain sight. And now, in the early hours of another morning, their story fades like their own signatures in invisible ink. The petticoat on the clothesline stirs in dawn wind over Long Island Sound. Just cloth, just Tuesday. Just history happening in the spaces between what gets remembered and what gets forgot. Let that image settle in your mind like dust on forgotten papers. A black petticoat against lightning sky. No one watching anymore. No messages hidden in its folds. Just laundry. Moving in the wind that blows across centuries. Carrying whispers of names that chose to be forgotten. Abraham Woodhull, Robert Townsend, Anna Strong, Caleb Brewster, Austin Rowe, James Rivington, Benjamin Tallmadge, the Culper Ring. They won a war by losing themselves. They saved a nation by agreeing to be erased from its memory. And then they went home. No medals, no parades, no monuments. Just back to their shops and farms and ordinary lives, carrying extraordinary secrets to unmarked graves. But for tonight, in this quiet hour before sleep, remember them. The ghosts of the revolution, the spies who chose to be forgotten, the Culper Ring, who traded everything you'd want from history for the one thing that mattered, victory. Let their story settle over you like an old blanket. Let your breathing slow, your thoughts quiet. Close your eyes. In the darkness, a petticoat moves on an empty line, keeping secrets that no longer need keeping. Sleep now. Dream of shadows that saved a nation, of ordinary people who did extraordinary things and asked for nothing but the privilege of being forgotten. Good night.